Welcome to 30 Seconds to Insight with George and Adam.
Hi, welcome to 30 Seconds to Insight. I'm George and I'm joined by Adam Smith. Adam, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
How are you holding up in your cell?
All good.
Okay, so I'm quite excited about this one because I spoke to someone else the other day who happened to mention something that made me think, that's quite interesting. And that's what we're going to tackle today. And the theme of this is all about what if your research finds nothing? And the context of this is I was having a conversation with someone the other day, as one does, and we were talking about research. And this person said to me, oh, yeah, we've done some research. It came back with nothing. And I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. Please expand. And he then said, well, actually, what they said was that there was no effect. There was nothing to see. It was a complete waste of time. Obviously, there's nuances to that, but that's quite interesting. So I thought today we could just quickly try and unpack that. Adam, it's a big ask, but do we know what that particular person is referring to when research comes back with nothing?
Yeah, so there's a practical point, which is if research comes back with nothing, it was useless. It means it had no impact on the business. Nothing was achieved from the research. And yeah, we've seen that plenty of times. But what you're alluding to, there was no effect, is more of a statistical point.
Okay.
There was no difference between the groups that they were investigating.
Okay, so when you talk about an effect, I mean, it sounds self-explanatory, but is it? Can you just explain quickly what that actually means?
Yeah, of course. Let's say we're looking at, we've got 5 consumer segments, and we do a bit of research to investigate the buying propensity of each of them. Came back, there was no difference between groups. We would say there's no effect here. There is group membership. Let's say we've got under 20s, 20 to 30s, whatever, age groups. There is no effect of the age group on the end result. That end result could be likely to purchase. It could be their concern with a certain product feature or something. And you know now that the group membership doesn't make any difference to the variable you're interested in.
So, and that's interesting because, and it's weird to try and frame this to somebody by saying, even though there was no effect, it doesn't mean we didn't learn something, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing that's difficult. And research perhaps hasn't done a great job in promoting that as a concept, which is even though you didn't really find an effect, then that's a finding in itself.
Yeah, completely. So let's go back to the age groups, right? So we wanted to show that our product was uniquely appealing to millennials. However, we find boomers, Gen X, millennials all love it the same. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you you've got a broader appeal than you first thought, and that there's huge implications for your further marketing. You've just radically increased your market size by including other groups. Now, that is no effect in statistical terms. The group membership has no effect on how much they like the product. That has a huge impact on what you do with the product.
Yeah. So in that instance, we're going from a niche audience to a mass market audience, aren't we?
I would say so. I mean, remember when we're calculating, the statistical significance or the effect size between groups, we are creating statistical summaries of data. Let's say we do it in a really small sample size, then we're going to need to replicate that. But if there is truly no difference between groups in a really well-designed study with thousands and thousands of people, that's always going to be of interest.
Yeah. I mean, you dropped in the statistical significance word in there, didn't you? And the other thing I wanted to bring up as well, whether or not it's related, I don't know. Perhaps you can explain, is null hypothesis.
Yeah, completely related. So the null hypothesis is just, we have a hypothesis that we want to test, that under 20s like our products more than over 30s. So that's the hypothesis we're testing. The null is there's no difference between groups. And so if the null is true, we would expect to see no effect.
Okay. So they are related.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
Okay, got you. And so is it possible in research when we talk about, again, little effect, is there anything, do you think, that clients or business owners can still act on? You mentioned some of the nuances between groups. Is that something that people can actually use?
So you're saying if there's a small difference between groups, what is someone going to do with that?
Yes.
I think that's the right question to ask, because that's what we really care about. In lots of research, you can get a statistically significant finding. You look at the difference between the groups is so small. You think, well, if we have to invest in targeting and 2 different campaigns and this and then extra spend on this, is it going to lead to increase in revenue? And you say, probably not. It's probably not worth it. So we end up looking for a big enough difference between groups to make it worth the while, targeting or treating those groups differently.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a great point. And that's when you sort of have to swap hats and go into commercial mode, which is, what can I actually do with this that's going to have something meaningful for the business? And it just reminds me very quickly of I once worked on a very famous drinks brand that had exactly this issue, and it had so many different pieces of data come in, so many different variables, so many different segments that actually almost none of it was actionable. So there's a whole ton of work you can do, which is almost folly, because you then have to ask yourself, what are we actually going to be able to action off the back of this?
Yeah, completely. And I think this is a great point to make on the term statistical significance. So that is a term of jargon that doesn't mean what significance means. That means significance has crossed a predetermined threshold of probability. That is not the different sizes between, it's not how meaningful the effect is. So when I was, I've been trained in this, I was always taught statistical significance is not the same as practical significance. So for an effect to be practical, it needs to be big enough to warrant it. Because you can always find small differences between loads of things. But what are you going to do with those?
That's really interesting, isn't it? And that's a big question. And I suppose you don't know until you run the research and then you get the data back and then you can look at it and go, oh, that's what it's given us. And then you have to then ask your question, which is, what are we going to do with it? So just thinking about some of these tests you talk about, I mean, how expensive are they? Is it a big investment for someone to actually be able to do one of these projects?
No, not at all. The main thing is providing the data is well set up, well structured, all your variables are nicely recorded, and we haven't changed multiple things across the data sets and it needs loads of cleaning. This can be done in really a handful of clicks. Now, you've got to be wary of going fishing in the data where you're just randomly looking for differences. But if you know in 2 years' time you've got a rebrand coming up and you think you're going to be targeting, you're going to be pivoting to target one particular segment, either a generational segment or a value-based segment, make sure you're collecting some data prior to those couple of years. And when it comes to, test for differences between groups or test differences in how creative performs, you can do that in a handful of clicks.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I think we're going to leave effect, null hypothesis, and its other fancy terms just for the moment there. So just before we go, Adam, can you quickly explain what statistical significance is, please?
Yeah, sure. And I think this will be helpful because we touched on the null hypothesis. So let's say there's no effect between groups, right? And so what we do with that is we create a random distribution of data points or a null distribution. We then look at our distribution, the data we actually observed in our study or observations, and we compare. We say, if there's no effect, what is the probability of getting the data that I got in this study? And that probability is the p-value. So you've assumed the null is true, there's no difference between groups, and then you calculate the probability of getting your data. That is not how big the effect is, that is not how important the effect is, and it's not the probability that the effect is true or not.
So what you're talking about is effectively, it's just a statistical phenomenon.
Correct. Exactly that. And that's why the significance is somewhat misleading. The term comes from statistical significance. It crosses a threshold that we deem significant, as in now it's interesting. So the p-value, if it's less than 0.05 or 5%, we deem that significant. That's a significant finding. One, that's arbitrarily set. Two, it might not be practically significant at all.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. Well, look, let's leave it there, shall we? Thank you for explaining that, Adam. Thanks very much for listening in. Again, if you've got any comments, please send them through to us. And again, if there's anything you'd like us to talk about, then just drop us a line. Until the next time, thanks for listening and see you soon. It's bye from me.
And bye from me.